Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction. The Russians during the previous 24 hours, 48 hours managed to discover another concentration of Ukrainian forces on the Kharkiv direction, and as a result of Iskander strike, that temporary position was destroyed with significant number of Ukrainians, or probably with some big ammo depot. We haven't received anything about any movements from the Russian side on the borderlines, but very interesting details we received from the Ministry of Defense report. You know that in the previous reports the Russians always were saying like the group of forces west or group of forces east or group of forces south on this or that direction managed to repel a significant number of Ukrainian attacks and, let's say, to defeat the Ukrainians lost and so on, right? And when talking about the report from the 20th of April, there is a small important thing that the Russians stopped using the directions for every single forces. Now they're saying just the group of forces west managed to achieve this or that results and so on. Currently I can't tell you for sure why the Russians decided to remove the directions from every single, let's say, Ministry of Defense report from directions, but maybe they're planning to refactor the, let's say, the line of combat contacts once again. We'll see. Now let's talk about the northern Kupiansk direction. The Russians had, let's say, during the previous 24 hours didn't make any attempts to attack the Ukrainian forces in Sinkovka or Kupiansk. Some details are coming from the central Kupiansk direction. According to information we have, the Russians destroyed once again the bridge along Oskol River between the villages of Sinkovka and Kruglyakivka. The Ukrainians, let's say, this is probably not the first bridge, not the first time when the Russians destroyed this bridge. During the previous year, the Russians destroyed the same bridge or the pontoon bridges in the area, let's say 4 or 5 times, and every time the Ukrainians, let's say, restore it once again. Southern Kupiansk direction, we haven't received anything, no movements neither from the Russian nor from the Ukrainian side, just a small advance of the Russian forces, more precisely some adjustments of the line of combat contact on this area due to published Ukrainian geolocation with FPV drone strikes. Sieversk direction, we have some updates. The Russians continue offensive operation in Bilogorovka, but for now without any changes on the ground. The Ukrainians published additional batch of video of FPV drone strikes on the Russian soldiers who were trying to storm the area. So as you can see, the Russians during the previous 48-24 hours haven't managed to achieve even a small result on the direction. During the previous 24 hours we got very interesting details from Verkhnykamianskaya direction. If you remember, a few weeks ago we got the video of how the Russian stormtroopers were, let's say, clearing these trenches, and we have some doubts whether the Russians managed to establish control over this stronghold or not. And today the Russian sources published the video of how they were pummeling this area with stealth flamethrower systems, which confirms that very likely as a result of previous attack, the Russians gained some results, but later were forced to fall back, and now the Russians start everything from the beginning. So the clashes for this stronghold is ongoing. For now, the Russians don't control this area, so probably we will change the color of this territory during the next few days. Southern Sieversk direction, the Russians continue clearing operation along the railways, attacking the Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian soldiers along the trenches, for now without any changes or any movements on the ground. Chasiv Yar, the Russians reached another defense belt of the armed force of Ukraine that goes from the village by the name of Georgievka, that located on the north. This is the northern flank of the Ukrainian stronghold, and currently the Russians, during the previous days, they made lots of attempts to break through this defense belt, but for now most of Russian attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians. From the other side we see some, let's say, attempts from the Russian side to finish this process as soon as possible, and today we got report that the Russians are planning to currently concentrating or about to finish the concentration of forces on flanks, and during the next few days the Russians will make the first attempts not just to establish control over the eastern Chasiv Yar, but to break through and to cross Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. We have report from the sources on the ground, from radio interceptions. There is an understanding that the Russians are preparing for assault operations along the entire line of defense in Bakhmut direction. The main goal of the Russians is to cross Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. In some areas, there is still a concentration of soldiers without active actions. So the Russians currently finishing the preparation, and after they finish the preparation, they will start this operation. Today we got some geolocations confirming that the Russians are getting closer and closer to Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and as soon as the first wave of attack, Russian attack, reach canal, then the Russians will launch the second wave with the purpose to cross the area completely. Obviously, the Russians will try to repeat the same attack as they, let's say, made during the battle for Bakhmut and during the battle for Avdiivka. Once again, the main purpose is to reach Kalinovka and to reach, let's say, the area between Ivanovska and Chasiv Yar, and establish control, first of all, over this part, because this is a very wide area that the Russians can use for supply support purposes. And the second, let's say, the same area is located between Kalinovka, Chasiv Yar, in this area. So these two most important, let's say, parts which can allow the Russians in the future to establish a safe and stable supply of Russian forces on the possible foothold in the central and the western parts of Chasiv Yar. When talking about the eastern Chasiv Yar itself, the Russians continue bombing the territory with multiple launch rocket systems, with FABs, but as you can see, without any changes and without any operations on the ground. Now we are moving further to the south in direction of New York and Toretsk, Dzerzhinsk. The Russians activated on this direction. During the previous months, we got significant number of geolocations of RBK 500 strikes, aviation strikes, which confirms that very likely the Russians started the preparation of the foothold before possible further offensive operation, which is most likely is going to start probably in August or September, not earlier. But anyway, now we are moving to Novomykhailivka, the north in Avdiivka directions. The Russians continue offensive operation either in Acheretina and Novomykhailivka ceramic areas. For now, the Ukrainians during the previous few days managed to concentrate significant number of forces on the direction, managed to stabilize the situation. Now the Russians are not moving so fast. They faced a certain resistance, certain level of resistance from the Ukrainian side, and now every single meter is getting more and more difficult for the Russians. But anyway, regarding and despite the difficulties and the losses, the Russians are moving, and this is very important. And according to sources on the ground, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to, let's say, establish control over additional 100 meters in Novomykhailivka, over additional 100 meters in Novobakhmutovka, 100 meters in Novomykhailivka, 200 meters in Krasnogorovka, and 100 meters south of Bogdanovka, additional 200 northwest of Pobeda. So the Russians are moving despite the difficulties and the losses. Also, the Russians continue storming the most important Novomykhailivka and Kalinova. Now the Russians are trying to penetrate defense belt of Ukrainians on the southwestern part of this agglomeration of towns, and very likely during the next 48 hours, the Russians will make first attempts to attack the Ukrainians along this line. I'll remind you that according to different mappers, the Russians have already established control over the main defense belt right in front of this part, over this territory, so it's not a very big deal to enter these trenches and to start storming the southwestern part of the stronghold. From the other side, we continue receiving reports from Acheretina. Despite the Ukrainian counterattacks and despite the Ukrainian concentration of forces, the Russians continue advancing. Currently, the Ukrainians don't have any solutions how to slow down to stop the Russians. The clashes are taking place, the heavy clashes are taking place in the southeastern part of the stronghold, and as we understand, as we discussed, the main Russian goal is to establish complete control over the southern part of the stronghold and to force the Ukrainians to fall back to the north of the railways. Currently, there is still very difficult situation in Berdichem. The Russians continue destroying the settlement, reducing the settlement to ruins. We see another artillery heavy preparation, and some sources are saying that after this artillery preparation, as a result of an unexpected attack, the Russians managed to enter this part of Berdych and basically to establish control over more than 80% of the settlement. So most likely during the next 48 hours, the Berdych will fall and the Russians will establish complete control over the territory. We haven't received anything from the line between Umanskaya, Yasnobrodovskaya, Nitailova, Pervomayskaya. The Russians took a small operational pause. They're not moving at all. And now they're mainly concentrated on the fields and artillery pocket between Nivoyska and Pervomayska. There are still very heavy clashes, but some sources are saying that the Ukrainians have already abandoned their positions. Maybe the Russians have already established complete control over the artillery pocket. Now they're doing some kind of clearing operation or something like this. Anyway, this situation can't, let's say, can't be endless. Sooner or later, either the Russians will establish complete control or the Ukrainians will basically surrender. It's very difficult to support these forces due to the Russian control over the positions to the south and to the north. So very likely this territory is going to fall very soon. Krasnogorovka, the Russians started pummeling and destroying and focused mainly on the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine that were located between the eastern stronghold and the Krasnogorovsky industrial zone. So based on the configuration, based on the map, we see the area of Russian concentration. So that was something like artillery preparation. On the video we can see the significant number of strikes the Russians made. The area was under very heavy fire, so very likely that after such artillery preparation the Russians will try to attack the Ukrainians exactly on this direction. And the main purpose and the main reason, the main goal of this attack is to improve the Russian positions, of course, and to establish control over something like this. This is very important, let's say, progress achievement that the Russians can, let's say, get on this direction. And the main purpose of the Russians is to cut and to establish complete fire control over the eastern, let's say, stronghold of the armed forces of Ukraine, the area of high-rise buildings. So this is the big painful for the Russians, because from this area the Ukrainians can control everything, including using the anti-tank missiles. But if the Russians are able to get as close as possible, then the Russians will establish fire control and Ukrainians will lose the benefits and, let's say, the things that they had before the Russians entered the territory. So now the Russians need just to block this area to make the Ukrainians deaf and blind there, and after that they will be able to move further, let's say, between the two strongholds and basically to cut the area in two parts. So as I understand, this is exactly what is going to take place, what is going to happen during the next days. The Russians will try to cut the area in two pieces and then to handle with both, let's say, strongholds, with both defense belts separately, with the central one and the eastern one. So this is exactly what is going to happen, as I understand. Georgievka, the Russians continue storming and attacks and clashes on the direction. According to pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians established control over the fields and the strongholds over the rich network of the fortifications between Marinka, Georgievka and Pobeda. As you can see, according to, let's say, map, there are lots of strongholds there. So it's very important, let's say, progress from the Russian forces, because from these directions, the Russians from these directions can easily continue offensive along N15 road and to enter another, let's say, network of fortifications and basically to finish the battle for Georgievka. Novomykhailivka, as we can see, we have adjusted the map because according to unconfirmed information, the Russians, as a result of very heavy clashes that took place for around 6 months, managed to establish complete control over the village. The Ukrainians were completely defeated and were forced to fall back. The forces of 79th Brigade, in the end of the battle for Novomykhailivka, published a short, let's say, summary of the clashes that took place during the previous 6 months, and according to them, they managed to destroy up to 314 armed vehicles on this direction, including tank, personnel carriers, and many other different, let's say, types of weapon. But so we can say that the battle for Novomykhailivka was the most, let's say, the bloodiest battle since the beginning of the special operation. Ugledar, the Russians continue clearing the farms to the north of Pavlovka. Very likely, most likely, during the next 48 hours, the Russians will make first attempts to cross the river by the name of Kashlagach and to establish control over the farms. This is not the first video that we received from this direction. During the previous days, we got few more videos from the same area. If we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of April, we can see how focused the Russians were on this direction. For example, this video we got just yesterday of how the Russians were bombing the farms to the north of Pavlovka, but from the western side. Today we received the video of how the Russians were clearing the farms from the eastern side. So it's obviously the clearing operation before the ground operation. And as we discussed in the previous days, the most important things that the Russians are planning to do is to get the farms and to get the intersection of roads, to establish control completely over this residential area, and to create a stable foothold to the south of Ugledar, which will allow the Russians in the future to start the final offensive, the final storm of Ugledar itself. So obviously after the end of the battle for Novomykhailivka, the Russians will start this battle as well. South Donetsk direction, Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian forces in the southern part of Rozhaina. After a short operational pause, the Russians renewed their offensive, their attempts to attack and to storm the area. Very likely the Russians within the next few days will launch another offensive with the purpose to get as far as possible to the north, basically to reach the central part of Rozhaina and to cut the main supply road between Rozhaina and Staromayorska. There is no bridge, but just to cut the area and then to start threatening the Ukrainian forces in Staromayorska from the east. So obviously something big is going to happen there as well. Zaporozhye direction, we don't have anything, just a few more strikes from the Russian side. Probably the Russians are planning to push further to Orekhov. On this video, basically, we can see the artillery preparation before further attempts to establish control over the territory. Odessa area faced significant number of strikes of Russian missiles during the previous 24 hours, and as I understand, as a result of those attacks, the Russians managed to destroy the fuel depot of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Ukrainians couldn't let's say down the fire for, let's say, 2 days. So it was a very heavy explosion, probably very big fuel storage. So most likely the Russians managed to deal lots of problems for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, there were a few strikes in let's say Odessa itself, and today we got report that the first 1,000 French troopers arrived in Odessa area, and most likely during the next few days the additional batch of French troopers will arrive in the area. Of course, 2,000 soldiers is not enough, but 2,000 soldiers is enough to release some Ukrainian soldiers who might be sent further to the line of combat contact. So obviously this is just the first case, but obviously we're gonna receive more and more. Furthermore, we got additional video from the borderlands, how the Ukrainians continue receiving military aid, military package from the Western countries. As we know, currently there is, let's say, the first, the first step to adopt the military package to Ukraine was already bypassed by the, let's say, politicians in the United States of America. The next week there are going to be additional votings, and after that Ukraine will receive significant number of weapons, significantly big, let's say, military package. According to information we have, the Pentagon is preparing to quickly approve a weapons package for Ukraine that includes urgently needed artillery and air defense and the systems. And as I understand, and according to the most of experts, as soon as the law will be adopted and signed by Joe Biden, within the next even few days, not months, but few days, the first weapon will arrive on the territory of Ukraine, and the war will be prolonged for another year, obviously. So this is going to be another year of very heavy clashes on the territory of Ukraine. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.